I find myself yet again thinking about the Strait of Hormuz. What if the United States could end this war with Iran without reopening the most important oil choke point on Earth? There seems to be a striking shift in Washington's strategy. The Wall Street Journal suggests Donald Trump is now willing to wind down the conflict with Iran, even if the Strait of Hormuz stays partially closed. Again, the waterway that carries roughly a fifth of the world's oil. The waterway Iran effectively shut down after the U.S. and Israel started this war. So what does that actually mean? Is this a sign the war has achieved its real objectives, or that those objectives have quietly changed? Because behind the headlines, U.S. forces are still building up in the region, and military options, from seizing islands to clearing mines, remain very much on the table. And if Hormuz stays shut, who really wins? Before we get there, a quick reminder to ourselves of the geography here, because it's key to what's going on now and what might happen later. The Strait of Hormuz is a critical waterway between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, with Iran to the north, and at its narrowest point, it's only around 33 kilometers wide. Unless you've been living under a rock for the last month, you know this is now a central flashpoint in the conflict, because 20% of the world's oil normally flows right through there. But that's not happening right now because Iran has effectively closed Hormuz. And this map can help show us why. Check out all those colored symbols gathered together just to the left of that high bend there. They're all ships and vessels. And according to the International Maritime Organization, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,200 vessels are trapped in the Gulf to the west of the strait. The knock-on effect, the growing global energy shock that's now impacting the markets and the cost of gas for so many around the world, including in the U.S. I'm joined now by Dr. Malcolm Davis, Senior Military Analyst at ASPI, Australian Strategic Policy Institute, who's going to help us unpack what this moment tells us about how this war might actually end. Malcolm, good to see you.
Thank you.
First, let's talk about how the Strait of Hormuz is operating right now. If you had a 24/7 bird's eye view of the strait, how would you describe the comings and goings?
Virtually nothing. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. If you looked at your map on the Persian Gulf side of the strait, all those ships are bottled up. They can't get through the strait. On the Gulf of Oman side, likewise, you have ships that can't get through the strait. The Iranians are allowing the occasional ship to go through from countries that are friendly to Iran, such as China, but that's it. There's no other shipping going through, and as a result, 20% of the world's oil supplies have been cut off, and that's creating economic chaos around the world.
According to the Iranian news agency, Iran's parliament has approved plans to charge a toll to ships passing through the strait. Is this war making Iran stronger and richer?
Well, that toll is being charged in Chinese yuan, so that is benefiting Beijing. But certainly Iran would benefit economically if countries were prepared to pay that toll. But it does set a bad precedent, and I think it basically boils down to extortion. So the international community should not accept paying a toll in Chinese yuan to go through the Strait of Hormuz, which, after all, is international waters.
I wonder, at this point, is military action the only option to open the strait?
Look, unfortunately, I think it is. Certainly, there's no indication whatsoever that diplomacy is succeeding. The Trump administration is saying that it's having very successful diplomatic negotiations with the Iranians, but there's no evidence to the effect that that is actually the case. And certainly both the United States and Iran have put forward positions that are equally unacceptable to either side. So unfortunately, the way I see it is that we are locked in for military action to force open the strait. That'll take a very long time, probably weeks, if not months, to actually achieve that. And part of that could involve the deployment of ground forces.
If Hormuz is no longer a benchmark, an objective for the U.S., What does winning actually look like in this war? Are we seeing objectives quietly being rewritten mid-conflict?
Look, I think that is what is happening. Unfortunately, the reality is that I don't see how the Trump administration can somehow justify or claim victory when the Strait of Hormuz is shut, because after all, that still would see Iran with a chokehold on international oil, an ability to effectively coerce countries around the world by cutting off their oil. I don't see how that equates to a US victory. After all, what you now have is not regime change in Tehran, but an intensified, increasingly rigid and extremist regime that have come to power in Tehran. You have Iran still possessing significant portions of missile capabilities. Yes, the Americans have destroyed the Iranian Air Force and Navy, but the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy is still largely in existence. And there's the real concern about Iranian acquisition of enriched uranium that could give them nuclear weapons. So all these factors, together with the fact that the Strait of Hormuz is still closed, does not equate to a US victory. If the US pulls out at this point and tries to claim victory, effectively they're accepting that their Operation Epic Fury has in fact failed.
There's been so much talk about the U.S.'s objectives because, well, I mean, it's war. And the public usually demands clearly articulated reasons that'll allow them to support the war. But it's also because people are trying to make sense of the mixed messaging from the White House. On Monday, Trump posted this on Truth Social. If for any reason a deal is not shortly reached, which it probably will be, and if the Hormuz Strait is not immediately open for business, we will conclude our lovely stay in Iran by blowing up and completely obliterating all of their electric generating plants, oil wells, and and possibly all desalination plants, which we have purposely not yet touched. Aggressive words about the reopening of the strait, but here's his White House spokesperson just hours later briefing the media about U.S. objectives.
With respect to the timeline, again, the President, Commander-in-Chief, the Pentagon has always stated 4 to 6 weeks estimated timeline for Operation Epic Fury. We're on day 30 today. So again, you do the math on how much longer the Pentagon needs to fully achieve the objectives of Operation Epic Fury, which I will reiterate: destroy the Iranian Navy, destroy their ballistic missiles, dismantle their missile and drone production infrastructure, significantly weaken their proxies throughout the course of this operation, and then, of course, preventing Iran from ever obtaining a nuclear weapon.
No mention about ending Tehran's stranglehold on the Strait of Hormuz. Whatever the goals are for this White House, Malcolm, if the U.S. ends the war before the strait is reopened, who really wins?
If that happens, then I would argue that Iran wins, because they have effectively kept hold of the Strait of Hormuz, denied it to the rest of the world. So the oil is still cut off. The regime is still in place. Yes, the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khomeini has been killed, but his son has now been put into his place, and the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, really now runs the show in Tehran. I think that, yes, the Americans have destroyed the Iranian Navy and the Iranian Air Force, and they've destroyed a substantial portion of Iranian missile and drone capabilities. But Iran is a vast country. They've been building missiles and drones for years. And so I would argue that it's likely that the Iranians still have substantial missile and drone stockpiles. And finally, there's that nuclear question, that enriched uranium, up to 600 kilograms of enriched uranium, potentially, that could be easily converted into nuclear weapons. So I'm struggling to see how the Americans claim this as a win, and particularly if the Iranians keep the Strait of Hormuz closed after the Americans withdraw. How is that a win? I think that it would be seen, importantly, by China and Russia as a sign of American weakness.
Obviously, the burden on reopening the choke point would, of course, fall on Europe and the Gulf states. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz seems to see the writing on the wall.
The best outcome is for this war to come to an end as soon as possible. Once the necessary conditions are met, Germany will, of course, be ready to make its contribution to ensuring freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. We've already put forward extensive proposals on the matter, and I'd expressly suggest that we do so within the framework of an international contact group, so we can also facilitate the best possible coordination between the states that are willing to help, such as Germany.
From a military standpoint, is that realistic, or is that essentially outsourcing the hardest part of the mission?
Look, in the beginning of the 1991 Persian Gulf War, then Commander-in-Chief of the US military, Colin Powell, had this thing called the Pottery Barn Rule, which basically says if you break it, you own it. I think the Americans would have an obligation in any multinational force to lead that multinational force to ensure that the Straits of Hormuz is opened. They can't just simply withdraw and say to Europe or the Gulf states, you fix it. So I do think that if the US does seek to disengage from this war, at the very least, they have to ensure that the Strait of Hormuz is open. Now, that will require a multi-week military operation to attack Iranian missile and drone capabilities ashore, to remove any sea mines that have been laid by the Iranians, to attack Iran's ability to launch drone and missile attacks from deep inland against ships transiting the strait. And we're talking a complex air and naval operation. Now, certainly Europe could step in alongside the Americans, as could the Gulf states. But the Americans have to lead. They can't just withdraw from the conflict and basically say to Europe and the Gulf states, you fix it.
This week, we're hearing from the Israelis about the fact that they are willing to wage this war for months, not the weeks that we keep hearing from the White House. How does that factor in, if it does at all, in the equation here about whether the U.S. should continue waging this war and using that time to try to reopen the strait?
Look, I think the Israelis do have a very different set of objectives for very good reasons. From their perspective, Iran with nuclear weapons is an existential threat to the nation of Israel. And so they want to see regime change. And what they're doing is going after the leadership, the political leadership, as well as the leadership of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. They're doing this in a series of airstrikes that when they identify a key individual in that leadership, they take them out. They're not going to stop on that because what they want to see is the regime overthrown, the Iranian people able to take back their country, and a more democratic and friendly government emerge that would be less confrontational to Israel and certainly would not seek nuclear weapons. What the Israelis don't want to see is the war end with the Iranian regime still in place, essentially dominated by the IRGC, and moving very rapidly to seek a nuclear weapon, because I think that after this war, if that regime is still in place, they will move very quickly to get nuclear weapons. So I totally understand where the Israelis are coming from, particularly after October the 7th. The Israelis are not prepared to see another massive attack on Israel, particularly one that could involve nuclear weapons. So they're not going to stop until they've achieved their particular objectives.
Malcolm, if the U.S. helped trigger a conflict around a choke point that carries about a fifth of the world's oil, is it strategically, even morally defensible to end that war while the choke point is still under pressure? Or does that risk leaving the world in a more unstable place than it was before?
In my opinion, it's not morally defensible. I think that the US does have an obligation and a strategic interest to ensure that the Strait of Hormuz is reopened, that maritime traffic can move through the straits freely without any threat of Iranian attack. And also, in terms of strategic interests, the US has to send a message of strength to Beijing and Moscow here. They can't afford to look weak, because if they look weak, then Russia and China will seek to exploit that weakness, and they may be emboldened in their own regions. So China in regards to Taiwan and Russia in regards to NATO's eastern frontier. The US can't afford to drop the ball here, because there's more at stake here than simply the Strait of Hormuz and the situation in regards to Iran. There's big geopolitical competition at stake here. And so I do think that the US has a moral obligation and they have a strategic interest in ensuring that the war ends with the Strait of Hormuz fully opened, Iran unable to contest or interdict any shipping that goes through the Strait of Hormuz. And that is going to require US leadership and US willingness to contribute the necessary military forces to destroy Iran's ability to interdict that shipping.
Dr. Malcolm Davis, many thanks to you. What do you think? What should be Trump's plan for the Strait of Hormuz? And what consequences could the world's economy face if it remains closed for the foreseeable future? Let us know in the comments. If you like this video, please hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already.